Ever scroll through your news feed, see all this amazing tech, like even self-driving cars are almost here, right? And you kind of wonder, is all this progress really making us any happier?
Yeah.
Like we have the world's knowledge in our pockets, but still, that feeling of discontent, it just kind of lingers.
Right.
So today, we're tackling that head on. We're doing a deep dive into Sigmund Freud's civilization and its discontents.
Okay.
Not exactly a light peach read, but
Yeah.
it definitely makes you think about this whole happiness thing in a different way. So no easy answers, but Freud's asking, can civilization itself be a source of unhappiness?
It's a great question to be asking.
That's what we're going to dig into.
Yeah, Freud's work is always a bit, well, it can be challenging, right? But that's what makes it so worthwhile. He's really getting at those deeper truths, even if they're not always pleasant. Like, he's saying civilization, for all its good points, it requires a trade-off. We give up some of our primal instincts
Okay.
for security, for order, but that comes at a price, a psychological one.
So a deal with the devil, except the devil is like our own need to have a society, rules, all that.
Exactly, and that price we pay, that's the discontent simmering just below the surface of it all.
Now, he's not saying, everyone go back to living in caves. Civilization has its good points. He's just saying, hey, is it really making us happier like we assume it should?
Right, it's a good point.
It's not a given.
Exactly. And Freud, he digs into this by looking at the specific instincts that civilization kind of tamps down and the compromises we make just to function within those rules.
So he's talking about like love, work, aggression, all that primal stuff.
Exactly. And those are interesting because they're so core to us as humans, yet always bumping up against the limits of society. So take love, or eros, as Freud calls it.
Okay,
Civilization needs it, but it also restricts it.
hold on. How can it do both? Need love and restrict it.
Think about family. So important in most societies, right? It gives love, support, belonging.
Yeah.
But Freud says that family unit, it can also create this us versus them dynamic.
So it creates strong bonds, but also divisions with the larger society. Interesting.
Yeah.
It's like we're hardwired for close connections, but those can clash with the whole idea of everyone getting along that civilization wants.
Exactly.
Okay, what about work then? Seems like a given in any society, right?
Absolutely. Freud recognized that. Civilization needs work to function. But let's be honest, not every job is all fulfilling and passionate, you know?
Tell me about it. But how does that tie into being unhappy?
Well, think about it. If you're stuck in a job you don't find fulfilling, just to be a cog in the machine, that can feel stifling.
Yeah.
And that tension between what you have to do versus what makes you happy, that's where discontent can grow.
It's like that classic struggle, what we want versus what society expects. You see people who are super successful by society standards, but still feeling kind of empty.
Right, exactly.
Okay, no, aggression, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Not exactly something we encourage.
Exactly. Aggression leads to chaos, which any society wants to avoid.
Right.
So civilization comes up with ways to control those impulses, but again, that repression takes a toll.
So we're basically sitting on this powder keg of primal stuff, trying to keep it contained with rules and expectations. And Freud saying that balancing act, that's at the root of our unhappiness.
In a nutshell, yes.
Wow. Okay, so where do we even go from there? How does that play out inside us, this whole struggle?
That's where Freud's idea of the superego comes in. It adds another layer to this. It's like, imagine a set of rules inside your own head. Your personal board of censors, shaped by your earliest interactions, especially with your parents.
So the superego, it's like our inner voice of right and wrong, coming from those early influences. But how does that fit into this whole civilization and unhappiness thing? And we're back, still trying to wrap our heads around Freud and this whole civilization and its discontents thing. Before the break, we were talking about that superego, that inner rule book we all have, often thanks to our parents, right?
Yeah.
It's like having this voice in your head, all those don'ts from childhood, trying to keep our wild side in check. But what happens when, those instincts kind of push back? How do we deal with that?
That's where Freud gets really interesting, I think. He's saying civilization itself gives us outlets, mechanisms to deal with that discontent, all that pent-up energy from those repressed urges.
So it's not just about repressing, it's about how we channel it all.
Yeah.
Give us some examples. How did Freud think we navigated all this?
Well, he talked about this process called sublimation. Basically, you're redirecting those primal impulses,
Yeah.
the ones that would be disruptive, maybe even dangerous if they ran wild, and putting them into something more acceptable, even celebrating.
So like instead of acting on those urges, you write a novel, compose a symphony, something like that.
Exactly. It's not that all art or innovation is just sublimated primal stuff, but Freud's saying these activities can be a kind of release valve. You channel that energy in a way that benefits you and maybe even society as a whole.
Wow. That makes you think about all those great works of art in a whole new way.
Mhm.
But Freud doesn't stop there, does he? He also talks about the not-so-great coping mechanisms,
Yeah.
the ones that just put a Band-Aid on the problem.
Right. He was really interested in intoxicants. And keep in mind, back then, things like alcohol, opium, they weren't seen the same way they are now.
Right. They were more commonplace, less taboo.
Exactly. And Freud saw that while these substances might give you a break from all that inner turmoil, kind of numb those repressed instincts, it wasn't without consequences.
It's like, yeah, you might feel better temporarily, but you're not fixing the root cause.
Exactly. He believed that relying on those external things to manage emotions, it actually makes it harder to engage with the world in a meaningful way.
So it's avoidance, basically. And we all know that doesn't really solve anything long-term.
Exactly.
We're back to that same tension then, the individual versus what society wants. We try to escape the unhappiness that comes from that, but by doing so, we might miss out on what makes life meaningful.
And that's where Freud, even though he can be a bit pessimistic about human nature, he does offer a glimmer of hope. He says a better, more fulfilling civilization is possible, but it takes a delicate balancing act.
I got to hear more about this. He didn't strike me as much of a utopian dreamer. So what's his vision for better civilization?
Freud believed it was all about finding a balance. Our primal needs on one hand, the demands of living in a society on the other.
Okay.
He said by acknowledging those instincts, not just trying to crush them, by finding healthier ways to manage them, we could create a society that's more stable and more fulfilling.
It's about finding that sweet spot. Not easy, that's for sure. Makes you wonder, what compromises are we willing to make, both as individuals and as a whole society?
And that's where you, our listeners, come in. Freud gives us the framework, but no easy answers. It's up to us to think about what a better civilization even looks like and how we make it happen.
So, lots to ponder. And speaking of things to ponder, we're about to dive into one of the most potent and maybe most messed up ways civilization tries to manage our discontent guilt.
Don't miss it. And we're back, folks, wrapping up this deep dive into Freud's civilization and its discontents. And let me tell you, things are about to get heavy because we're talking guilt.
Yeah, guilt.
That feeling we all know, and let's be honest, don't really love.
Yeah,
But Freud's saying it's not just a personal thing, it's like built into the system.
right.
The secret weapon civilization uses to keep us all in line. So how's that work exactly?
Well, the thing about guilt is it works on different levels. There's the obvious kind, right? You break a rule, you feel bad, there are consequences. But Freud's saying there's a whole other layer, this unconscious guilt that's always there, under the surface. Okay, now you've got my attention, but you're also kind of freaking me out. Unconscious guilt. What's he talking about?
He's saying just the act of suppressing our instincts, all those primal urges society tells us are no good, that creates this like low-level constant guilt. We might not even realize it's there half the time.
So like a constant hum of not good enough, even when we're doing everything right. That's kind of bleak, don't you think?
It is, and that's where the superego comes back in. That inner critic, remember? Freud says it can be pretty harsh.
Right.
Always there to point out our flaws, real or imagined, and fueling that unconscious guilt.
So it's like this voice of authority, maybe our parents, maybe society as a whole, constantly reminding us we're messing up.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Civilization takes advantage of that. Our superego doesn't just come from our own experiences. It's shaped by those bigger societal norms, those unwritten rules we pick up on.
So civilization's like hijacking our development, using it to keep everyone in check.
You got it.
That's kind of messed up when you think about it. And guilt, both the conscious and unconscious kind, that's the tool that makes it all work. We're so afraid to screw up, to be different, that it keeps those primal urges under wraps.
Yeah, exactly.
Like an invisible fence we put on ourselves, with the threat of guilt being the shock.
And it's not even about the big stuff, right? It's the little things, everyday stuff, where we don't quite fit in that can trigger it.
It's exhausting, this constant pressure to conform, to be good. It's like, who even sets these standards anyway?
Right. And that's where Freud connects this to our unhappiness. He says this suppression, this pressure to be something we're not, that's a recipe for misery, even if we don't realize why.
So we're giving up a part of ourselves just to be accepted. Makes you wonder if it's worth it.
It's a big question. And it gets even more complex with what Freud says next. This unconscious guilt, this feeling of like not quite belonging. He thinks it might actually fuel some of our greatest achievements.
Hold on, we're channeling guilt into art, into science,
What?
all that now. That's just wild.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head trip. He doesn't say it outright, but he suggests that these things we create, the things that bring us joy, connection, they might also be a way to make up for those repressed
Like
instincts.
we're trying to earn back points for being bad.
It's a strange thought. Are we driven to create, to achieve because we want to, or because we have this deep-seated need to prove we're not so bad after all?
Makes you look at everything differently, right?
Yeah.
Even our biggest accomplishments might be rooted in this feeling of being flawed.
And that's Freud in a nutshell. He's not saying to stop creating, but to be aware of those forces at play.
Yeah.
The urges, the rules, how we find our way through it all.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's less about answers and more about, like, starting a conversation, right?
Absolutely. Freud doesn't give us a how-to guide, but he gives us the tools to understand ourselves, all our complexities, a little better.
It's about seeing that tension between who we are deep down and what society wants us to be and finding a way to live with it without losing ourselves in the process.
Well said.
And on that note, dear listeners, we leave you to ponder all this. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into what it means to be human in a world that doesn't always make it easy.